So I will go back and sign into my. Good? Yeah, okay.
Testing. Okay. So now we have.
And test. Okay. Good morning, everyone, in here and out there. Can someone from out there let me know if you can hear me and see me?
Yeah, we can
Please?
hear you. We can.
Awesome.
We can
Thank
hear
you. Okay, so click reclaim host or stay co-host.
Reclaim host so that you can control everything.
Okay,
Okay, so now you want to share screen, this one, share screen, and then one. This one.
and then do I move it over here?
No.
No.
Share. So everything that happens here,
So
they
I
see.
can control from up there?
Yeah.
And this is what they see right now?
And it's the same for those
Okay.
members.
Oh, I see. Okay, now to get, I'm gonna open, where did it go here? No, not this. Where did I go now? There it is.
That one. Will you use the
Oh.
presenter? No.
I beg your pardon?
Will you use the presentation, the slideshow, or?
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, use slideshow. Yep.
Oh, okay. I see. And then,
Maybe you can also open the chat and drag it here so that you can see if there's anyone there. Or drag it. Oh,
wow.
yeah, I think it's okay.
Okay, thank you, Kenneth. Okay, so good morning. I'm not sure yet how to organize the rhetoric and the discussion around welcoming. So I'm going to welcome everyone I can see with my human eyeballs, and then I will welcome everyone off in Cloudland. to the class. I've got the chat now with Kenneth's help. The chat is on a screen that I can watch at the same time as the PowerPoint. So I think that should make it easier for me to keep up with the chat while also keeping up with the people in the classroom. A practice I'm much more used to. So I'm still learning the other stuff. On the other hand, now I'm kind of, that's weird. Oh, I see, it's that camera. Okay, so this camera is not catching me at all. Oh, okay. But, and it can see, and this is the whiteboard. Okay, so we're good.
If you want, you can zoom in. This one. You can use this one to control the camera.
Yeah, this is what they see. Oh no, or is this what they see?
Both. They can
Both.
see both.
Oh, cool. Oh, okay, right, with one like that and one like that.
It's like this one.
Okay, right.
They can just
Yes.
switch whichever video they want.
Yeah. How embarrassing. Yeah, well, and it's embarrassing enough this time, but I'm afraid you're gonna have to tell me 3 times. Okay. Right, so first I want to take attendance. Sarah, and then Amanda? Atia, okay. And then, where did Sarah go? And what's Adviti? Okay. And what's your name, young man? Mohammed what? Bagan, okay. Excellent. Okay, and I won't take remote attendance. I don't know why exactly. It'll just maybe take too long. Your names are all there, so I can track that on my own separately. Now I want to go to slide. I'm going to pick this up where we left off last week. So the plan for today is I'm going to push my way through the ideas and issues and interests part of the assigned reading, the reading that I asked you in the first week I asked you to read for last week, and part of which we covered, and part of which we're going to cover today. And so what I'll do is I'm going to jump into the ideas, I'm going to review a little bit the ideas framework, and then I'm going to look more substantively into the discussion that Treblecock and Kelly give of the substantive discussion they give of the 2 main ideas that they argue underwrite the development and the history of the Canadian immigration system, the legal component of it. And along the way, I'm going to develop elements of an argument that the conclusion of which is that their philosophical account is problematically incomplete, in a way that I'm going to spend most of the rest of the semester, or parts of the rest of the semester rather, trying to indicate some of the ways that other scholars have tried to complete that framework. And so the liberal ideas, small L liberal ideas that are discussed by Treblecock and Kelly, that they claim, more or less claim, sufficiently exhausts the field of available ideas to, on the one hand, describe the Canadian immigration situation, and on the other hand, support the normative component that they argue is provided by the ideas framework. So we'll put some meat on all of those. And then partway through, in about an hour, I forgot my phone, in an hour, if someone could remind me, an hour from now or so, we'll take a break. And then after the break, we're going to take a look at the news story that the news analysis is asking you to consider in terms of this framework, and we'll take a look at some of the aspects that could that at least could be part of what it is I'm asking you to reflect on and then comment on in that news story, connecting it to the chapter. So that's the plan for today. So I need to get to slide number 23. Now, okay, so let me just move around a little bit. So everyone can still hear me out in Cloudland, out in the synchronous chat thing?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. Right, so, well, I'm going to skip forward a little bit. I've got. One of the questions, so we began the course looking at belonging, and I've asked you to watch that video about belonging, and I wanted to, my idea, my goal really, and starting from belonging, is to provide a way into the course from a starting point where you already are. And the notion, not necessarily that you've thought about it in terms of belonging, but the notion of belonging, especially as it operates in academic and also in complicated ways, some of the complications of which we will be looking at as the semester goes along in activists, among activists who are pressing the Canadian government for changes in immigration law, or for who are pressing sometimes the courts for changes, or who are pressing society more broadly to pressure the government on making changes one way or the other. So the two main directions of change that activists press for is letting more people in and letting fewer people in, or letting some specific more people in and not letting some other specific people in. And so we're going to take a look at aspects of those two sources of pressure on the government, and how the government responds to those sources of pressure. People who want more people in and people who want fewer people in. Why do they want more people in? Why do they want fewer people in? And how do they go about making that happen? How does the government decide whether there should be fewer people or more people? And in the last many years, no government in Canada, no party in Canada has successfully run and won control over the government. And more recently, in the last 30 years, no party's even run on anything other than a high total of immigration to Canada. The only question is how high, and then the main question is how many should we accept, and within that debate, who should we accept? So we'll take a look at some of those, but I want to, that's the sort of medium-term goal. What I want to discuss now is the ideas component, and I want to take a look at the details of the argument that's offered in the reading, because all of these ideas are operate in the background of contemporary modern consciousness. I'm going to have to make good on that claim. What I mean by that is, even if you disagree with them, it's almost certain that almost all of you will find them familiar. There's a certain kind of common sense feel to the ideas that are being suggested. And that's part of the issues that we're going to take a look at. So the way the argument operates is, in the course of the journey chronicled in this book, our hope. I want you, as you read this book, to think about that. Who is our in that sentence? So the author here is speaking to the reader. Who wrote the book and who is reading the book? It's an academic book, and the reader here, the our, is Treblecock and Kelly, law professor and former, I'm not sure what Kelly does now, but when she wrote the book, she worked for the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, or she was a United Nations official. They have expertise in the subject matter, and the book is targeted, arguably at least, and this is one of the decisions as readers that we have to make. Our here speaks to, in part, you as students, as opposed to what? As opposed to immigration, people applying for immigration to come to Canada, or people in Canada trying to either justify or understand or adapt or change their views. This is an academic book, and I'm asking you to recognize academic moves that are made in the argument, and that the use of that pronoun is one of those. This is an author speaking, this is authors speaking to their readers, bringing you into the argument, trying to position you or maybe reposition you in that argument space. Okay, so now, so we have our again. Now, how has our, if I move, is that going to move with me? Let's see. I can't. Huh. Okay, so how has our contemporary communal self-definition been shaped by the lessons of history? Here, the our has shifted a little bit. People around the, students around the world potentially are going to read this. There are courses in the United States, for example, there are Canadian studies programs. In Australia, there are Canadian studies programs, and students around the world, immigration is, migration, immigration, the movement of populations is an increasingly widely studied academic subspecialty. And so students around the world, more typically outside of Canada, it would be more typically graduate students who'd be taking a look at this material, but they would be included in this hour. Here, the contemporary communal self-definition refers to Canada, the development in Canada. So there's a slight shift here in the perspective of who's covered by our. Now, for the most part, I didn't notice this in the first 5 or 6 times I read and reread the introduction. I'm asking, and it's not crucial for a working understanding of the broad scope of the argument to be able to notice this. What I want to call to your attention is how the language operates in the background. How language generally operates, sometimes in the background and sometimes closer and closer to the foreground of the argument, and how it can shape your interpretation of that argument. An argument is being offered for your consideration, and so we'll leave it at that for now. So how has our contemporary communal self-definition been shaped by the lessons of history? As Canadians continue to grapple with immigrations in the future, what do the lessons of history suggest that we might aspire to become? So what this means is that in part, at least arguably, they're making the argument that immigration has a contribution to make to the Canadian identity, to who it is that Canadians are, who they think they are, and how they came to, how that came to be. The question of identity at work here. and a question of aspiration into the future. Okay, so. Okay, so I want to go back now to connect that to the three different ideas here. So, or the two ideas, liberty on the one hand, and on the other hand, community. And what they're arguing, let me erase this for now. The fundamental argument discussed in the first chapter is that the idea of liberty and the idea of community, when the logic of liberty and when the logic of community are followed to their ultimate conclusion, their ultimate consequences, they push immigration policy in opposite directions. Liberty, on the model that the Treblecock and Kelly developed, is understood as essentially a notion about individuals. It's a reality about individuals, putting individuals first and community as derivative of individuals. And the logic of the reality of community, as they argue, is, so it's an argument that I'm asking you to think about, to consider. The logic of community is the community existing before individuals. And I'm going to start with that component. So I'll just start with that component to try to give a sense of how anybody could land on this view. In academia, for sure, there's in the social sciences, in law, in business schools, in many different disciplines and sort of intellectual environments that are typical of academia. By and large, in 2023, and this was true in 1997 or whenever the book was written, I forget when the first edition came out, but it's organized explicitly and more problematically implicitly around the idea that the fundamental category for humans is individuals, that we are in some complicated sense firstly individuals and derivatively everything else. I want to put pressure on that idea. I want to, first of all, claim and then explore a little bit that this is the common sense starting point of academic discourse and more broadly the self-understanding of modern consciousness. And I think there's a problem, a weakness here. But to the degree that I'm right, that this is the common sense position, I want to motivate, I want to provide some kind of reference to you for the conditions under which community might be understood as prior to individuals. One starting point will be to take a look at, this isn't meant to be proof that this is false. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find a way that you can see, that we can see in our own experiences, some of the ways that we're deeply tied, deeply not necessarily in an emotional sense, deeply in a broader sense. It might only be intellectual, but it also absolutely might be in a personal, emotional sense. I want to include all of those possibilities. But just, I forget if we did this last week, but just take a look at my name for a second. In Canada in 2023, if you take a look at my name, did we do this last week or the week before? Okay, good. So if you see that this is my name, one of the things that this tells you is something about my father's name. Not automatically, not 100% necessarily, but in a common sense way, in Canada in 2023, if you know that this is my name, you very likely also know, in this case correctly, that this was my father's name, but it wasn't my mother's name. I was born into, so before I was born, before even my parents met, if, as it turns out, my mom and my dad were going to have a child, already before I was born, my name pre-existed, my last name anyway. In different cultures, this operates differently. So it's for that reason that I want to be clear that I'm not trying to provide proof of the claim. I want to illustrate for you some of the ways that community operates in the background, largely independently of, in this case, not just me, but also my mom and my dad. If knowing my mom, as I now know my mom, and I obviously didn't know her before I was born, if my mom had lived 50 years later, I think there's no way she would have taken my dad's last name. I think that my mom, who was a feminist even back then, but wasn't particularly radical, I think she would have kept her last name, and my name probably then would have been Kelly Goulet. Kelly was her maiden name, but in I don't even know when my mom and dad got married actually, but before 1961, when they got married, it was very, very rare for women, even for feminists, to not take their husband's last name. So she took her husband, she changed her name. These options pre-exist. They're community-based conventions, but they're deeper than just conventions. In the same way as for many people, not for everybody, but for many people, their name is more than just a bunch of letters. My name, and for many of you, I'm sure, your name is something, it's a different category of things from your student number, right? It's absolutely possible that you don't remember your student number. You don't remember, this came up in class last Friday. Some students don't remember their login to their computers because the machine is set up to remember it for you. So you don't need to memorize your login. It comes up with some, in a complicated way that's not totally unrelated to all this, but we don't have enough time. The machine now will often generate for you a password, one of whose features is that you can't remember it, right? These complicated passwords that are prompted, that are securitized, and that are meant, allegedly, I think that there's other things going on there, but whatever they're meant to do, they're designed so that they're very hard to remember. The consequence of that, intended or unintended as it might be, is that you don't remember it. You just let the machine come up with it. But that's not the way it works with your name, right? Our names come from somewhere. So my last name comes from my dad, and Antoine, my dad's older sister, who was my godmother, her name is Marie Antoinette. And so Antoine comes from my dad's older sister. That kind of tradition exists in all sorts of different cultures. And so my identity is tied to a past that existed before, not just before I was born, but before even my parents knew each other. My mom more or less knew when she was growing up that if she had children, their name wouldn't be her last name. And that in the 1950s, when my mom was growing up and she wasn't yet married, but she was already an adult, didn't object to that. The effective power of the community was to have that be not just seemingly acceptable, but unquestioned. Our belonging to communities, it doesn't exactly impose these things on us, but it creates a world into which we're born, and which many aspects of which we simply accept as a natural thing. And they change over time. So my daughter is not married, but I'd be surprised if she ever got married. She has a partner. He's lovely. I think he's terrific. And I hope they spend the rest of their lives happy together. But in a way, I hope they don't get married. I hope they just stay together. But she does all kinds of things that, it's not my life. So I'm happy for her to follow whatever path. But if she does get married, I'd be very surprised if she took her husband, or if he becomes her husband, if she takes his last name. It's a new world, and that wouldn't be shocking. There was an intervening period, say the 1970s, where it was kind of surprising. And so this community, this one small-ish element of community manifests itself that way. And that migrates sometimes anyway into society in a more formalized way. In Quebec now, I haven't actually read the regulation, so I don't know this to be, I'm not sure of exactly how strong it is, but if you marry in Quebec, you take on your spouse's last name as well. So in Quebec, there are far more double-barreled last names, because now if a woman marries, she has to go through extras. If a woman marries someone else, I don't actually know for sure how it would work if two women married, but I think it would work the same way. So if a woman marries, the default option in the paperwork involved in the legalization, in the legal marriage status, is that she then takes on, either she keeps her name or she has her name and her husband's name as her last name. That's the legal setup. The government passed that law, and the government passed that law at least in part under pressure from women organized feminists in Quebec, put pressure on the Quebec government to do that as a reflection of their own understanding of what the community wants and of what the community's not getting. And so the government passed a new law that changed how the names are going to be passed on, how the woman's name is and what the children's name will be. Now, in that law, it is, you have the option. I think you just have to pay extra or fill out some more paperwork. And so if for whatever reason, as an individual, you and your spouse decide that you want to keep your husband's name and give up your own last name, you can do that. So there are women in Quebec, as I understand it, but again, I haven't checked this. There are women in Quebec who don't have a double-barreled last name for a number of different kinds of reasons. Some of them having to do with a different sense of community than what has come to be the effectively dominant sense of community in Quebec society in the 21st century. So there are some people, certainly there was widespread enough support for this change in Quebec to have this happen, but there was resistance. There were lots of people who complained about this. They thought crazy feminists have lost their minds and weak, blah, blah, blah. And so there was resistance, there was dissatisfaction, but not enough to prevent this change from happening. So community will have an impact on, for example, your own name, and your name has, or at least can have, a connection to and an impact on your own sense of identity. And remember, or I want to recall for you that how has our communal self-definition been shaped by the lessons of history, and in particular, what we're concerned with is the development and the history of immigration to Canada. And the sort of the big takeaway picture would be, if you look at government sanctioned images of Canadians in 1950, I bet if you looked at 1,000 photos that were generated by the Canadian government, everyone would look like Sarah and me in those photos, even though it wasn't the case even in the 1950s that there were only people of European descent in Canada. In Canada, already in the 1950s, there were people who looked like Sarah, people who looked like me, but also people who looked like the other, the rest of you in the class and also out there. And the Canadian government's self-understanding of what Canada looks like has shifted. Now, I've posted in Blackboard the 2022 report to Parliament on immigration, and they have many, many, many photos. And in those photos, part of what they're doing is they're presenting and they're representing to Canadians a different image of what Canada looks like. And in those photos, Canadians look like they're all of us in this room. There are people who look like Sarah, people who look like me, but also people who look like Aditi and Mohammed and so on. The image has changed. The self-image has changed, partly as a result of, the official image has changed. Has the image in our communal self-definition changed? That's a much more difficult thing to be sure about. And it's difficult in another sense in which this community, this sense of community is complex. It is a moving kind of reality, but a reality nonetheless. An example of this is when I was at McGill as an undergraduate, I shared an apartment with Sami Masoud and his brother Michel. They were from Lebanon. Now I forget actually if they were refugees. They were not. They came to Canada during there was a civil war in Lebanon, and they came to Canada during that civil war. His mom and dad were intellectuals, and Sami had done an undergraduate degree at American University in Beirut, and he was in Montreal at McGill doing a master's degree in political science. So we became friends and we chatted, and he was really the first person from the Middle East that I'd become friends with, roommate friends with. So I got to know, and we would talk the way 20-year-olds or 25-year-olds or however old we were talked about the future. And he already had very strong views of what he would be like as a father. And his children were going to speak English, French, and Arabic if it was the last thing he did. He was committed to reproducing many, many of the aspects of his own experience. He was proud to be Lebanese, although anyway, Lebanon's a very complicated country, as it turns out, but he was still very proud, and he wanted this. He had in his imagination, for him to be who he was at 25, included imagining his children, what his children were going to be like, and in particular, the language that they would speak. Before he had ever met the woman, it turns out he's been with now for a long time, and before their children were born, Sami was committed to that other language. That turns out to be a much, much more difficult thing to achieve. In particular, having your children learn Arabic in Montreal is harder than having your children learn either French or English in Montreal for historical reasons. And so the language that you speak, and through the language you speak, your own sense of your identity. With Arab, now, Sami is not a Muslim, so Arabic isn't internally connected to a faith community. Sami, I mean, it's been a while since I've spoken to Sami, so I don't know exactly where he is right now. But back when I was sharing an apartment with him, Sami wasn't a religious person in a spiritual sense, but Lebanon, in some ways, loosely connected to the Canadian situation. There were strong communities that existed in some kind of there was a civil war at the time, so the cooperation had broken down. But Christians, Muslims, Jews, lived in Beirut and have lived in Beirut for a long, long, long time. And they got along and didn't get along, and it was tricky and it was difficult. And sometimes it was more difficult. Sometimes it was less difficult. And American and Israeli interference in Lebanese and Iranian interference in Lebanese politics made and continue really to make civil war an almost permanent risk for people who live in Lebanon. But the language that you speak is sometimes connected more deeply than simply some casual thing, closer to what your name is than what your student number is. If you're ordering a coffee, the language you use just to get the coffee is closer to, it's just an instrumental, it's just a tool that you're using, right? You could just point and say, you know, or I'll have number 3. And even though you really love your latte with whatever, as long as you get the coffee you want, then how you got it is a separate matter. But for Sami, it was crucial to him when he was 25 that his children would speak Arabic as well, that they would be able to sustain and maintain in Sami's new home a language that he brought with him from somewhere else, his own self-image. And language in Canada in particular is explicitly included in our constitution. In Quebec, it's part of the constitutional starting point of Canada as a nation. The people in Quebec and the government that they choose are entitled to, and in some ways even required to, maintain French as the language of that place. At that time, they were all, so in 1867, in that same constitution, in addition to having a linguistic, an extra linguistic authority in the province, they also had a religious commitment and authority that is no longer nearly as active, nearly as central in Quebec as it was in 1867. And that is, Quebec wasn't just a French place, it was also a Catholic place. Language continues in Quebec to be an important and in some ways divisive force, but Catholicism, the role of Catholicism in Quebec has been transformed dramatically. And although it hasn't prevented, so the role of Catholicism has diminished dramatically in Quebec, same with all around the world. Overall, there are places where that's not exactly still quite as true, but overall, Catholicism is no longer as dominant a force as it used to be. And so this notion of community changes over time, and it has external effects on us, and it has internal effects on us. One of the external effects that it has in Quebec right now, though, is that if you're a Sikh, you cannot teach in class wearing your turban. It's against the law now in Quebec. I'm not 100% sure how successfully or how effectively. I think it's a terrible law, but I'm struggling to stay on the one hand neutral and descriptively accurate. I think, though, that for the most part, it was Sikhs and Muslims that were, I think, many people think, and in many ways, the government and the party and the parties that supported this act in thinly masked ways have allowed this impression to persist that it's an anti-Muslim, an anti-Sikh consideration rather than an anti-Catholic or an anti-Jewish one. And so there are particular aspects in Quebec society, particular communities in Quebec society whose latitude to live in public, manifesting their commitment to those particular communities, is constrained through the law. In Quebec, the communal self-definition is now organized more around the idea of individual liberty Quebec does this in the name of what they insist is a secular state. Every individual in Quebec is free, and they argue that that individual freedom is somehow damaged, so that if I was a Sikh and I had a turban and I was teaching in a classroom, that the students who weren't religious themselves, their ability to get somehow that their ability to get the government service offered through the classroom, or if they're going in person to a driver's license office, the government employee who interacts with clients can't be wearing what's called conspicuous religious symbols. A little Catholic cross is okay, but a Sikh turban is not okay. A hijab is not okay. Liberty and community often coexist with no problem, but sometimes they fail to coexist. Sometimes problems are generated. Now, certainly it's the case that not all individual liberties coexist equally smoothly. Same with the belonging to a community doesn't always work that smoothly. Lebanon is a good example, or helpful example in that sense. In Quebec, I'm old enough to remember in 1969, in pursuit of the latitude for Quebec society to pursue its own self-understanding, its own communal self-definition, groups in Quebec organized themselves to resist the Canadian government, and they, the then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, invoking what has subsequently been demonstrated to be something he just made up, but invoking an existing law, the War Measures Act, it was called then, sent tanks into the streets of Montreal in order to prevent the most radical groups in Quebec who were fighting for basically national independence. So Trudeau said, thank you, Kenneth. Trudeau claimed that there was an apprehended insurrection, and that justified sending in armed troops, and they arrested thousands of people. And they, because there had been certainly, it's true that some small percentage of the people in Quebec who had organized themselves to reorganize society used violence. And so the FLQ, the Front de Libération du Québec, organized itself into cells, and they kidnapped the British Trade Minister, James Cross, and eventually they released him. And they also kidnapped the Quebec Minister of Justice, Pierre Laporte, and he was executed by the FLQ, almost certainly. There's a tiny little bit of doubt about whether they did it, but I don't think it's almost everybody believes, and I 99% believe that the FLQ basically bungled the kidnapping, and eventually at least his body was found in the trunk of a car at a military airport outside of Montreal. So there was violence, and there had been a few bombs. This is against a global background of national liberation movements around the world. The FLQ modeled itself on the Algerian FLN, the Front de Libération Nationale in Algeria. I don't know what it is in Arabic, but in Algeria, many of the educated Algerians, because Algeria was colonized by France, went to school and university in French. And so some of the organization was organized by French-speaking Algerians. In Quebec, there was some solidarity. The Algerians had links with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They had links with the Irish Republican Army, all of which were engaged in armed struggle against what they considered to be their colonial oppressors. This sense of community in conflict with this sense of liberty, at its strongest, leads to armed struggle. It leads to government repression against communities, and it leads to communities picking up weapons in order to assert what they believe to be the rights of their communities. And that has happened in many, many places, in all kinds of different contexts. It's still happening today around the world. In Canada, we're lucky's not exactly the right word, but it's not exactly the wrong word either. We're spared that right now for complicated reasons. But so this notion of community for many different communities is born very lightly. When you belong, and to the degree that you belong to a community or to multiple communities, because we can have multiple community identities, they can coexist very easily. And over time, for most of human history, most communities have been successfully coexisted for at least short periods of time. We've figured out ways to, if not respect each other, at least not kill each other. On the other hand, there have also been loads and loads and loads. Human history is soaked in blood. It's soaked in blood between communities. It's also soaked in blood in families, right? We know in Canada, and this is true around the world, that husbands kill their wives, ex-husbands kill their ex-wives, parents kill their children. The blood-soaked nature of human experience, a difficult thing to reflect on, but insofar as we're being adults about this, insofar as we're trying to understand as full a picture as we can, we have to accept that, right? Yesterday, over the weekend in California, 2 more mass shootings. Violence happens, and it's not quite random. I mean, I think random violence does happen, but all kinds of organized violence also happens. Those are the high-level stakes, and often they don't occur. Often we find ways to reconcile our commitments to our communities, and also more recently, in terms of the arc of human history on our planet, in terms as individuals. Individual rights is a mechanism and a system, in a way, that has been developed in the last 200 years or so to make it easier to resolve some of these inter-community problems and also some of the intra-community, right? Inter is between and intra is within. So I just want to give a fuller picture of the reality of community. Often, when everything's going well, these ideas don't come up, right? If everything's going fine, we don't need to worry and think about all of these things. It's only when things start breaking down that we have to start, when we're looking for solutions, then that's when we turn to ideas. We turn to other things too, but sometimes we need to turn to ideas. What I wanted to highlight for you is a sense, either directly from your own experiences or from your knowledge of other people's experiences, of the way community is a real force in our experiences. And that the purpose of the name is to give you an idea of the reality of it. In this case, there's a legal consequence of it, and that law has changed over time. And the range of that law, the range of phenomena which we experience as citizens covers what your name is, how you're going to get married, and it also covers how you can dress at work, how you can express. So far anyway, there's no law in Quebec or in Canada that I can't wear, whatever color this shirt is. There's a little bit of red, there's no law around that. But in Quebec, there's a law against me wearing a turban. So I have to choose between being a teacher and being a Sikh in Quebec. in 2023. And that's defended on the basis of this notion of individuals being, of individual liberty. Liberty understood as, I'm a bit puzzled that he chose the word liberty rather than the word freedom. In English-dominated philosophical circles, typically liberty is the American accent used to describe what everyone else generally anyway in philosophy talks about as freedom. So initially it took me a while to get used to this, but for our purposes, freedom, liberty, I think liberty is a more legalistic version, whereas freedom is a little bit more metaphysical. But as a foundational idea, it exists in both realms. It's a metaphysical notion, and also it's a legal principle. And so I want to take a look at, I've forgotten which direction I have to go. So partly as a function of the intellectual climate or the pattern of in the 1990s, this was much more clearly the case in the 1990s in English-speaking social science circles and legal circles. These were the three dominant models for a philosophical account of liberty. There was a libertarian view, a social contract view, and a utilitarian view. The utilitarian view ultimately argues there's no such thing. On the utilitarian view, there are no ideas. All there really is human preferences. And what society ultimately, the most accurate description of society is simply the accumulated result of individual preferences. And that's most effectively modeled by, and also it's most effectively modeled by the marketplace. And the marketplace turns out on utilitarian views and on a number of other, there's a number of other ways of landing on this conclusion, but utilitarians land on the conclusion that the market is also the most efficient way of maximizing the joint realization of people's preferences. In particular, the marketplace is always in the medium and long term going to be better positioned to be able to jointly meet, that is, meet at the same time, the needs and the wants of humans who are interacting with each other, especially compared to governments. Governments on the utilitarian view are necessarily going to be less efficient at distributing the limited resources that humans have available to us on our planet in this real world. There's only utilitarianism, the sort of the historical development of utilitarianism is a little bit more contested, but it's largely an English invention. Historians of philosophy, I think, correctly argue that there were important early contributions from French, from Dutch, and from German thinkers, and so on. But it's largely from Scottish and English thinkers that the utilitarian tradition emerged. Now I forget which point I was making about that. Now, hang on. Well, anyway, the marketplace is, so it emerges at a time in England and in Scotland to a greater degree, but also in Holland. It wasn't called Holland, but in that part of the world, and to a considerably lesser degree, but looking at it from the contemporary perspective, when we look back at the developments in France to a lesser degree, in some parts of Germany to a lesser degree, marketplaces and the market economy were increasingly involved in, oh, now I remember what the connection is, I'll get to it in a second. We're increasingly involved in the distribution and the redistribution of all of the necessaries for human survival: food, water, clothing, and the luxuries as well. And that had a derivative, a secondary, but not negligible influence on how these markets operated and how the understanding of marketplaces emerged as an ideological mechanism that people who were opposed to particular aspects of the existing governments used. But the reason I wanted to point to this historical example is that in, say, 1750 or so, that's around when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, the oceans were seen as being effectively infinitely large. The imagination, the human imagination back then could not imagine that we could fish all this fish out of the sea, that humans could get out there, get on boats and capture so many fish that there wouldn't be enough fish. I don't know how historically true this is, but one of the myths around the early part of the European component of Canadian history had Portuguese and French sailors sailing off the banks of Newfoundland fishing for cod. And they came when they're first, the diaries of the captains of these ships, when they got back to port in Europe, they reported that the cod is a fish, it's a big fish. The cod were so thick that you couldn't see the water, and it looked like there was just fish to be had forever. We know now in 2023 that that's an illusion, that it's not true, and we're no longer allowed to fish cod. Well, I never did, but in Newfoundland, for generations, many people made their living fishing cod, but we ran out of cod. And so it seemed like the marketplace. So the main takeaway here is that, at least in principle, and we now know we're becoming increasingly aware in all sorts of different ways that it's not just in principle, it's in fact in practice. It's a thing, it's real. We live and we survive on the basis of limited resources. Most geologists, most scientists who turn their attention to this believe that we're going to run out of oil at some point if we keep consuming oil and we keep discovering oil at the current rate. So even if we pursued and drilled for all the oil that the scientists believe exists on Earth, really not on Earth, if we keep consuming oil at this rate, eventually we will use up all the oil that's available that we can drill. Oil is not an infinite resource. We now know, as a result of global warming, that it's not inconceivable, or that it's easily conceivable that the ozone could be depleted to such a degree that eventually the air will no longer be breathable and there won't be enough oxygen. Thankfully, we will have been made extinct much earlier than that through all kinds of other catastrophes. But the idea is, even the atmosphere itself, which when I was your age, did largely feel, although when I was your age, the knowledge was already available, but it wasn't widely available, that we were already in the 70s and 80s. It was clear, it was becoming clear to informed scientists that we're in deep trouble. We live on a planet with limited resources, and distributing those resources is a necessary condition for human survival. That's always been obvious with food. And it's been obvious, at least in the following sense, that the historical archaeological record demonstrates that up until about 1800, everywhere on Earth, periodically there were famines that killed many people, and the entire communities were wiped out as a result of inability to get enough food to sustain human life. So we've organized ourselves, we as humans, other species do it in, arguably at least do it in some other ways, but we as humans have had to organize ourselves to get enough food to survive. And the marketplace is a crucial mechanism through which that occurs. And utilitarians argue that ultimately the marketplace is the most, and in its strongest version, utilitarians argue it's the only rational way to organize the distribution and the redistribution of the limited resources that are available to humans through picking apples from a tree all the way up to the CERN super collider, like all the latest developments of human technology that send rocket ships out into the far reaches of the universe. All of that technology and its productive capacity, its enormous productive capacity. There's 8 billion people now, and we produce easily, right now, we produce easily enough food for everybody to eat. But the marketplace, at least so far, is not always 100% successful in distributing those resources. Utilitarians argue, utilitarians acknowledge absolutely, and in some ways it's their starting point, the marketplace is not perfect. What they argue is that it's always ultimately, not always immediately, but always ultimately going to be the most efficient mechanism available to humans to distribute the result of human production and to direct human production. We produce now, we didn't used to, but now we produce to a very, very great degree. We as humans on Earth, organized internationally, organized nationally, organized locally, we produce most of what we do for the marketplace. Most production is now organized more or less directly to sell on the marketplace. And utilitarians make the claim that in a way, so utilitarians claim that that's the only rational way, and all of the other accompanying human practices that we have developed and inherited that interfere with that interference is really a reflection of power struggles that are not rational. And that if we reorganized our societies to match the rationality, the imperfect but efficient rationality of the marketplace, we would maximize that's the maximum way we have of avoiding the power struggles that have characterized human history up until today. I'm deeply opposed to this view, but I recognize on the one hand that it's very powerful and it's widely held. And so I'm doing my best to save for another day several of my criticisms of that view. So the utilitarian view ultimately claims all there is a marketplace. If all there was a marketplace, then, or to the degree that that's the case, Canadians have been acting irrationally. And they've been acting irrationally relative to the standard that the marketplace would dictate. What the marketplace dictates, the logic of the market, the utilitarian version of the idea of liberty is we should admit to Canada exactly as many workers as we can put to work in order to facilitate the maximally efficient operation of the marketplace. If bosses need more workers, God damn it, let's let more workers in. And we've got to resist, on the utilitarian view, we have to resist whatever other kinds of impulses, wherever they come from, to limiting the number of workers we accept. Conversely, when the economy goes downhill, when because the reality that utilitarians and basically everyone accepts is that a society organized on the basis of a marketplace is subject to ups and downs. The prices are going to go up, the prices are going to go down, and sometimes those curves go so big that there are conflicts between the demands, the needs of the citizens, of the people who live here, and the ability to produce enough to satisfy those demands. When productivity is going up, we need more workers. When productivity goes down, we need fewer workers. And on the utilitarian view, on one version of the idea of liberty, we should just take as many people as the marketplace needs. When they need more, we take more. When they need less, we take less. And anything else is irrational. Anything else is just a legacy of some old-fashioned idea. And it's not just that it's suboptimal, that on the strongest utilitarian view, is that doing anything else is going to lead ultimately to more suffering. It's not going to help the people who are coming, and it's going to harm the people who are already here. If we have too few workers, then we're going to either lose out the business opportunities that we'd be able to realize with those extra workers, or if we have too many workers, then wages are going to go so low that the workers who are here already won't be able to afford to buy the stuff that's being produced by the workers here and the workers around the world whose stuff we buy based on the price that the market dictates in 2023 or whatever year you might have. Social contractarianism argues instead that the community is a reality. It's just the case that we are in a community. And what we need to do is, because the marketplace is not, at least not so far anyway, a self-sustaining entity. The marketplace, everywhere and always, at least in the medium run, organizes a set of laws that constrain people's behavior. Marketplaces ultimately require contracts. Contracts require laws in order to force people, either scare people or force people to live up to the terms of the contracts into which they've entered. Laws require governments. So governments are ultimately, on this social contractarian view, a necessary condition for the continued existence of marketplaces. And the libertarians argue that they're a necessary evil. So the difference between these two views and this view, on this view, government is just, it is simply inefficient. Libertarians argue that there's a minimum amount of government that is required in order to create the conditions that are needed for the efficient operation of a marketplace. Social contractarians argue that once a society is up and running, even when it's organized on the basis of a marketplace, just like the reason that the minimal government is required is to honor the contracts that people enter into, to sustain that reality, to sustain the commitment that we have to each other to honor our contracts, generates a bond among us. And in order to sustain that bond, in order for following the law of contract to operate, humans have found that the best way to do that, and arguably the only way to have that work, is to have all of our mutually agreed on commitments honored. So that if in Canada we claim that we owe a debt to the Afghan citizens who helped our armed forces in Afghanistan when we had troops pursuant to a United Nations, etc., in Afghanistan, then on the basis of our, let me just go back now to my slide, on the basis of this thing, the communal self-definition, that we're law-abiding citizens who honor our agreements, then we're going to honor our agreements with Afghans who helped us in our war effort, even if it means that that's not the optimal marketplace solution. Even if employment goes down and so on, we're going to honor those arguments. The social contractarian view is the view that, um, right, so then, let me just get rid of all of this.
Hi, Professor. Is your screen, you think your screen's off? We can't see anything.
You can't see anything at all?
I see where it says the issue, but it's showing black where you're talking.
Okay, great. Black or white?
Actually, I can see fine. I don't know.
You can see fine, someone can see fine, so I'm
Yes.
waving now. Can
Yes,
someone-
I can also see fine. It's fine for me as well.
Okay, so that might just be then a you thing, whoever it was. I couldn't see which student was seeing that. And I can barely get my own machine going. So the idea that I'm going to be able to help you, I'm afraid, is well, it's hilarious, but not in a good way. I can't help you. An hour?
Like, are we supposed to see the classroom and the as well? Because that's what I'm not seeing.
Well, there's a difference between you not seeing the classroom and you just seeing black.
I don't see the classroom, but I can't see. I can only see what you have posted on the PowerPoints.
Oh, I think then, maybe I will be able to fix this. If I think if you go to chat, no, that's not. There's some, well, the best I can do is suggest that you play a bit with the buttons, the mute, and can you see the buttons at the top of the screen now where my cursor is?
Yeah, I can see that.
I think that one of these buttons is going to allow you to open up the little window where what I think you'll be able to see is one little square on the side of your screen that the camera in the classroom is catching, and then the icons for all of the other students who are logged in. Is that what some of you see out there? And my arm, I don't know why.
I will log back in and log out and see if that changes.
Okay, and I'm going to take a break now, and then we're going to come back, and I want to make a few comments about descriptive versus normative. Okay, so it's break time. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll start up again. What's your name? Jamal what? Okay. Roshan, there we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Good, okay. Right, okay, so now I know what I want to do. Now. What the hell? There.
Line was terrible.
Oh, well, good for you. I'm buying the fancy coffee. It seems wrong. Oh, well, but I think it would have taken just as long to get coffee. So. Okay, so I'm going to get started again. So with this, so I want to turn now to take a brief look at data. This isn't going to be a data-driven course for a variety of reasons, but there is, first of all, there is an enormous amount of data that's available. And so what does this data show? So what this is the plotted on the bottom here is the urban migration, and along the top axis is the total number of immigrants landing annually in Canada from 1852 to 2012. I'm not at all sure what the significance of 1852 is, why they started here, but in any event, what I want to point out is the at least superficial, I think it's more than just the superficial convergence between the data, between the number of people who land and the state of the Canadian economy as this is normally understood. And so what we get is we have tremendous growth here, and then all of a sudden a precipitous decline, and then very low and flat immigration landing numbers over the period from 1930 or so to 1944, 45, and then we have other peaks and valleys. But this right here represents is the Great Depression. What happened in the Great Depression is the Canadian economy, Canadian economic growth dropped dramatically, and Canadian unemployment went up dramatically as well. So you had two converging pressures on the government to no longer admit as many immigrants to Canada. And that is falling prices for production. So there was less demand for workers on the part of employers. And consequent upon that decline in demand for workers was a drop in the wages for those workers who continued to find employment. And so workers didn't want more people coming from anywhere else because of the understanding, which is accurate, at least in the short run, in 1930 anyway, that more workers would put downward pressure on wages. And the accurate, again, in 1930 terms, understanding that if prices were below a certain level, then the producers themselves, the people who owned the means of production, wouldn't be able to realize a profit on the amount of money they were spending, including wages, but not just wages. So if you own a factory, you have to hire workers, but you're also paying for the materials. So if let's say I own in 1930, let's say in 1920, I own a factory that makes tables. So in 1920, that means I have to buy wood, I have to buy glue, I have to buy a certain amount of tools, and I have to hire workers to turn that wood and that glue and nuts and bolts and whatever else into tables so that I can sell those tables at the stores in, if I'm in Toronto. And I have to worry about the price of wood, and I have to worry about the wages I'm paying. And either I own the land that the factory is on, or I rent it. If I rent it, it's just a straight up expense. If I own the property, when you own a property, if you're a capitalist, it makes more sense to sell that property if you can realize a price that's greater than the profits you would realize from running a factory on that land. So even once you own the land, let's say you inherited it from your mom. So you own a spot in Toronto where you can build a factory. You didn't have to pay a penny for it. In a certain way, it's still costing you money to operate that factory unless the difference between the costs that you have to incur to produce those tables is greater than the result of selling all of those tables minus minus what you could get for that land, say leasing it out to someone who's doing some other business. So you have all these costs to worry about if you're running a factory. In 1922, the economy's going well. People are buying stuff, and it's harder to find workers to put those tables together because the economy's going so well that all the other employers are also looking for workers. So under those conditions, I have to pay higher wages than I would have to pay if other employers weren't looking for those workers. But in 1929, the stock, I think it's September of 1929, the stock market in New York crashes in Canada and in the United States, but also in Europe. In 1929, I'm not positive about 1929, 1930, 1931 out west, there's a terrible drought. There's crop failures, which wipes out grain production. So the price of grain initially goes up, costs are going up, wages are going down. And so there's a precipitous decline in the number of people that the government allows into Canada. The Canadian government decides to, in response to economic pressures, and this is on the utilitarian model. This chart reflects the extent to which, more or less independently of anything that's going on in anybody's head, anything that's going on in anybody's heart, what the government did under these this is what the government did under these circumstances. Why they did it is tricky. Many of them absolutely explained it the way the utilitarian model did. Unions that represented workers argued loudly, often publicly, for the government to decrease, to diminish, to not let any more people come to Canada, because more immigrants to Canada, wherever they came from, and in 1929, immigrants to Canada meant Sarah and me. It didn't mean you. This wasn't a racist thing yet, or mainly anyway. It was against an already existing racist exclusion of people who didn't look like me. I'll leave Sarah out of this. So the background condition here was already largely white supremacist anyway. But under those circumstances, because of the condition of the global economy, but in particular in Canada, they were worried about the Canadian situation. So the number of immigrants declines. And then likewise, we get these peaks correspond very largely. Here we have the energy crisis, when global oil costs doubled in a matter of weeks. And that put the Canadian economy in a recession for a number of years. The government's response is to diminish the number of workers, the number of immigrants coming to Canada. And in general, this correlation between those two components, the productivity of the Canadian economy, is a solid predictor, has been over the course of Canadian history, seemingly largely independently of any notion of self-identity and community and so on, seems to have driven it. On the face of it, that's what the data seem to show. So the way all the quotes we've looked at so far are from the introductory chapter. And then the book, wait a minute. Why is that not happening? Okay, here. So at the end of the book, in the conclusion to the book, he writes, "We have explored these questions in detail in each of the major periods of the history of Canadian immigration policy. In summary, the evidence suggests that economic interests, in particular the interests of capital, such as land developers, shipping companies, the railways, and other employers, were a dominant influence throughout most of the history of Canadian immigration policy, and that their interests generally prevailed over those of organized and unorganized labor and other settler interests." So this is at odds in some ways with the commitment made by the authors at the beginning of their book. They claim at the beginning of the book that sooner or later, I forget what the exact quote from John Maynard Keynes is. I won't bother fooling around to go get it, but they claim that they quote seemingly sympathetically, seemingly as an endorsement of their claim that ideas somehow are the ultimate cause of the changes in immigration policy in the introduction. But the conclusion is to some degree at odds with this. What is the connection between ideas on the one hand and this claim that it's the interests of capital that actually determine to a large degree what was going on? And so we're going to I'm going to try to develop an account that brings these two sorts of claims into, in my view anyway, in the view of the authors whose views I will be describing, reconciles these two trends a little bit better, at least according to me and to the authors who I'll be citing. And in order to get there, I want to take a look at this news story. Where did it go though? Here we go. So can you hear me? Am I audible out there in asynchronous, synchronous land?
Yes, Professor.
Okay, and can you see the screen, the CBC story on the screen?
All clear.
You have your thing? Okay, good. So this is the story I'm asking you to analyze in terms of the framework developed in the chapter. So the headline, the story is from January 7, but the story is PSW. What's a PSW? Personal service worker wins fight to stay in Canada with daughter after deportation order suddenly reversed. So the syntax of headlines, so I mean that after the deportation order is suddenly reversed, they do it like telegrams for some reason. I'm not sure why, but in any event, that's what that means. And so we have, and it's not nothing, and it's part of what's going on, or I'm going to argue anyway. They didn't have to have a picture, but they have a photo. What do you think the effect of the photo is on you, and what do you think the predictable effect of this photo would be on many people? Pardon? Sympathy, empathy, absolutely, right? It's a very nice picture. It's yeah, they don't identify. I don't remember if the daughter's named in the story. Better probably that she's not. But here's a mom and her daughter. It's a very sympathetic photo. It's a photo that people who aren't white supremacists anyway will find endearing, right? It's a mom and her kid at the kid's birthday. Those of us who have kids, we recognize this. It's a nice day. This is what Canada's supposed to be like. This is what everywhere is supposed to be like. You're supposed to be able to celebrate your baby's birthday. If that's what you do, right? The idea is those of us who don't have children, it's easy for us to project this, to recognize this as something that's worth doing. This doesn't take away anything from me. This doesn't take away anything from any of you. This is who Canada, this is the feeling of this photo is what Canadians like to think Canada is about. Not only, not all about, but this looks to us, or this is, I would say, at least portrayed by the CBC as a good news story. And it looks like a good news story. A mom and her baby are going to get to stay. But not just any mom, she's a PSW and it's 2023. What's going on in Canada in 2023 around PSWs? I'm not sure if you know this or not. I don't know how many of you, and it doesn't matter particularly, but do any of you know what's going on with PSWs in Canada in 2023? Let's see out there.
Is it because there's a shortage of healthcare workers?
High demand, shortage, yes. So because is stronger, that's sort of the question. Is it because we need PSWs? Or is it because, God damn it, we're decent people and we're not going to rip a mom and her baby away on their birthday, right? Or can it be both? Are those two things in competition with each other? Part of the question is, why do this? How does this fit in? Is this primarily about the curve that we saw on the previous slide? There's a demand for PSWs. So we're letting the PSWs in. Well, it can't just be that because she was a PSW before her birthday, and her being a PSW, in fact, has seemingly nothing to do with her having a baby. Part of what we're going to look at is that seemingly can be put under some pressure. Who does PSW work? Who does that kind of work? In Canada and around the world, it's far more likely to be women who do that kind of work. The Canadian economy and the global and the capitalist economies all around the world, not absolutely everywhere, but in many, 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 many different places, PSW work, caring work, is more likely to be done by women than it is to be done by men. Caring work is also more likely to be less well paid than other kinds of work. It's likely to be less well paid, whether or not it's done in the context of a for-profit organized enterprise or for a government-run enterprise. PSWs in Canada, when they work in the government sector, even when they're represented by a union, have lower wages than a number of other kind of union organized workplaces, and to a greater degree even than in non-union organized workplaces. Are these independent factors? Is that strictly a marketplace situation? Do women earn less money for their work for solely efficiency reasons, solely marketplace reasons, or is something else going on? And how does that fit in with immigration? These are the sorts of questions that we'll be looking at. We'll be looking at what kinds of answers are available to those questions, and we'll be looking at, do those questions have an effect on how immigration policy has been organized and changed and handled, especially since World War II. We're primarily going to take a look at the contemporary situation, but in order to better understand the contemporary situation, we're going to regularly take looks at parts of the past for comparative purposes. So how does this story go? Some of what we're going to be taking a look at is the way news stories enter into framing the discussion. News stories, as stories, but also as news, enter into, or at least arguably enter into, our own definitions of ourselves, and also our definitions of ourselves as Canadians. They don't make them, they don't force us to be one thing or the other, but they're at least arguably, I think, practically obviously, but at the very least, an argument has been made by a number of different academics that there is a recognizable link, a recognizable connection. It doesn't go all the way to a deterministically causal connection. It's not as though if all the news stories agreed exactly and there were enough of them, it would change everyone's mind. But it is the case, at least according to the people who analyze this carefully, that there are patterns and convergences, and we'll take a look at those patterns and convergences. So let's, I think I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. Yeah. So the headline, PSW wins fight to stay in Canada with daughter after deportation order is suddenly reversed. So we have a nice photo, and then the story starts. She was nearly ripped from her 3-year-old daughter, but in a sudden reversal, the Toronto personal support worker who faced deportation, despite having worked on the front lines during the height of COVID-19 pandemic, can now stay in Canada permanently. In a certain kind of way, I wonder, anyway, in a certain kind of way, that sentence all by itself captures the whole course. What does the fact that she was served on the front lines have to do with anything? What might it have to do? So what? What follows from that fact with respect to whether she should be deported or not?
Since you worked so hard during the whole pandemic without it, still was thinking about sending her out of the country.
But how do they decide who should be deported or not? And what's the connection between being deported and the kind of work you do? Maybe, but the deportation, well, okay, we'll see if we can pull out a few more facts. Where did it go? So Najuma, 29, had been facing deportation to Uganda, a country she says she fled for her life after being disowned by her family and for her religious and social affiliations. So she made a refugee claim, and the refugee claim was refused by the Canadian Immigration Department, by the Immigration and Refugee Board. She went through the appeals and she didn't satisfy the conditions for a successful refugee claim. And nonetheless, so that's the background condition. Is her being a PSW a good enough reason? What if she had been a stockbroker? Or what if she had been unemployed?
I don't know about unemployed, but if she would have been stockbroker, then she's definitely earning a good living. And looking at her situation, how she fled, from Uganda in protection of herself, it adds a good point. And also working in the front lines tells us how sincere and how much she contributed to society in a positive way. In Canada, when they needed employees to do that work, she was there to step up. So I think these few factors tells us about how she is as a
Her character.
her character.
Right. I think you're right. That's what this story is saying. That's not how, in fact, the law operates. That's not how the law is supposed to operate even. So we'll keep reading here. Now her fight is over. She remains concerned.
If she was a stockbroker, the government would have seen bigger they would have thought like, okay, she's helping very effectively move the economy for even in the smallest bit she could. She is helping progress the economy forward. So we might need her rather than.
But what about someone who is right now waiting in country X, who has a job offer to be a stockbroker, but is not allowed in Canada yet? She got that stockbroker job. She just came here. Didn't wait in, allegedly didn't wait in line. She jumped the queue. The refugee process is separate completely from the regular immigration process.
But doesn't it depend on situation also? Because looking at this, it's an emergent situation because she cannot go back to her home country. She'll be.
Says her.
But I mean,
it's not like they're in war right now. She's just been abandoned by her family. So she could still
but
live in
in
Uganda.
understand in countries like USA and Canada, it's still safe to be in a country where your parents disown you. But in countries like India or Uganda, it's a threat. It's a threat to your life.
But who gets so?
But who gets to decide who comes in and who doesn't because of war or because we're abandoned by your family?
And we're going to see in a second. Let's scroll down. I hope I got the right story here, but.
Are there clauses under the refugee section in the immigration law? Because refugees who came because of war have a higher preference, but there are different types of refugees.
So in part, Canada accepts refugees, eventually, we didn't do this right away, but I think it was 1951 when the UN Convention on Refugees was signed globally. Canada did not sign up right away, even though we participated in the drafting of that convention. Canada wasn't immediately prepared to meet the conditions imposed by that convention. But eventually, I think it was 1957, the details don't matter particularly. There's an international agreement that's quite old now, that's been around since the 50s, and we've been actually, maybe it was 69 now. In any event, there's an international agreement it's an international legal agreement that sets out in legal vocabulary the conditions that have to be met to count as a refugee and to not count as a refugee. And part of what Trebilcock and Kelly claim, and I think they're largely successful in the overall claim, that the Canadian government has historically been more likely to recognize as legitimate refugees people fleeing certain countries rather than certain countries or certain kinds of countries compared to people fleeing other kinds of countries. Not all terrible situations, including not all wars, are equally recognized as worthy of our concern by the Canadian government. Yeah.
I'm only assuming this point that I said previously was because I saw a documentary where a family coming from Saudi came to Thailand, and the girl, the family member, she protested against her family, and
Right.
she was in a hotel for like a couple of days.
Yeah.
And I think one of the members of UN came to Thailand, and they took her to Canada.
She was in Thailand, right?
She was in Thailand.
Yeah.
So she, from the
Right.
airport, they got.
And wasn't she a member of the royal family or something like that? I think.
I don't remember.
I think she was high class, but I think your point, even if she's not, your point is
But do
important.
you know that case?
Yes,
I
I
think
remember
that-
it now from the news. I didn't remember. it.
Solely based on the fact that she was. It was
Solely,
threat-
we don't know, but let's keep going.
But that was the main point of the case, that she was, it was a threat for her to go back to Middle East, one of the countries from Middle East.
But it was Saudi, and that's a good case, if I'm remembering the details right, because it illustrates another component that is difficult to keep track of, but that regularly reappears. The current government, the current Canadian government, when it was in opposition, criticized the previous government, the conservative government, because the conservative government signed a contract to supply Saudi Arabia with Jeeps, with military grade equipment. It was a very big contract, I think in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And when the Liberal Party was in opposition, they, in my view, very rightly criticized, because Saudi Arabia is right now engaged with the United States and a few other allies in a terrible war with Yemen. And the Canadian government took the position that we can't count on, that there's a law in Canada that says that we cannot sell weapons to countries when they're actively engaged in wars that aren't sanctioned by the UN, or I don't know what the details are, but the Liberals said, no, we're Canadians. This is who we are. We're these people up here. We don't sell tanks and Jeeps to countries that are bombing with drones, people who live in an extraordinarily poor country, children are dying. The situation in Yemen is atrocious. I think worse, I don't know about her particular situation in Uganda, and when she was in Uganda, but the situation in Yemen is terrible, and it's made terrible to a considerable degree because of the weapons that the Saudi government is able to buy. And the Canadian government sold these weapons. But when the Liberals won the election and came into power, all of a sudden they were no longer quite as clear about the contract. And ultimately they agreed to maintain, they then claimed when they were in power that because the previous government signed this contract, it would cost us a lot of money to go back on that. So some people think, I think I'm one of these people, that we let her in partly because we look bad for cozying up to Saudi Arabia on this weapons deal. And so I think it's a good thing that we let her in, absolutely, but other background things are going on. I think I mentioned last week in this class that we accepted refugees from Syria, but we were especially keen to accept certain Syrian refugees and much less interested in accepting other Syrian refugees, in particular Christians from Syria. Now, it's true, or I believe that it's true anyway, and there's good evidence to believe that the current Syrian government was targeting Yazidi Syrians in particular. So I'm not saying that it was easy to be a Yazidi Syrian. They were under very difficult circumstances. But the Canadian government seems to pick and choose, not based solely on, exclusively on how terrible the situation is, but in part on that and in part on other things. What are the other factors? So we're not taking in nearly as many Yemeni refugees as we are Ukrainian refugees. It seems that from the point of view of the Canadian government and the CBC, that Ukrainian suffering is somehow more important, more worthy to be on the news, and more worthy to be remedied by the Canadian government than is the suffering of certain other groups of people. Why is that? Ukraine produces oil, we produce oil. Or the Ukraine-Russian conflict, among other things, is at least arguably an oil conflict. Is that why? Is that just being cynical? If it is just being cynical, we still would need some kind of explanation why Ukrainian suffering somehow seems to be more important than Yemeni suffering. Because I'm not exactly trying to convince you of anything. I'm trying to describe it to you how it is, the kinds of questions we need to ask when we think about Canada in a global world and the place of belonging and citizenship and migration in this development of a Canadian self-image. Yeah.
Could it be because of conflict in ideologies of Yemenis and Canadians? Because I think Ukrainians are more of a, I wouldn't say, they don't go more towards the religious side. I mean, it's always easier to, it's not me saying, I was saying that.
Yeah. I appreciate your responsibility in articulating your point clearly, and it's worth doing, but go ahead.
But a lot of, as we see in Quebec, how they do not want people wearing turban to teach. They do not want people coming from religious background to be a huge part of the community.
Some religious backgrounds. The Yazidi, they come. They have a religious background.
I don't know where majority of Ukrainians are in terms of religious standpoint, but also one reason could be the length of the suffering, because I think Syria has been in a war since a long time compared to Ukrainians, and it seems like a inverted situation because now we have to make allies, this and that. So this could be one of the reasons that's why
it absolutely certainly could be. I don't believe it for a minute, but it absolutely certainly could be. I think there are less, I think that there are explanations that are much less like this in terms of their effect, and more like, where do we have arms contracts and oil contracts? I think that the government, and it's the relative autonomy, the relative independence between these kinds of cases and shutting our doors when the economy goes down. And so if we go back to this, I don't know how am I going to do this. Sorry?
She was telling me how majority Ukrainians are Catholic.
Is that what it says? Right, but it's Ukrainian Catholic, it's not Roman Catholic. Still, it's Christian, definitely. Yeah. But by and large, Ukraine, well, it's complicated, but Ukraine has rediscovered its religion since the fall of the Berlin Wall and since the fall of the Soviet Empire. Still, it's not largely on the basis that the public version, the Canadian government's support for Ukraine is not organized on the basis of their support for Ukrainians as religious, as Christians. That doesn't come up, I don't think, ever in the news, or almost never in the mainstream news. Well, I in this case, I think it's true. I don't think they care about, or I do think that if it had been instead Kazakhstan, which I believe has a much higher percent population of Muslims, or if it had been Muslims, then it would be like the idea that Christianity, the idea that religion isn't an issue is easier for Canadians to accept when the religion is Christianity than when the religion is Islam or Hinduism or Sikhism or other religions.
But I still feel that Canada is very open, as in it's very accepting towards all the cultures and religions. And one
yes, I think that many people feel that way.
Compared to other nations, Canada is like more.
And that's also a very important point. there are two standards that we, as we here being students of migration to Canada, rather than, or in addition to being, say, Canadian citizens or activists or something along that. Just as students, global students of migration, I think it's clearly true that Canada accepts more on a wider range of reasons than many other countries. Absolute, and especially when you compare the number of people accepted compared to our actual population. So we accept many more refugees than the US does in absolute terms, even though the US is 10 times larger. We're much more open than the US, and we're open to a wider range of justifications. We can compare ourselves to what other people do, but we also should compare ourselves to what we say we're doing and to why, and to the reasons we give for doing what we're doing. We say that we're admitting Ukrainian refugees because they're suffering. But that can't be the complete explanation, because we know for sure there are people suffering in lots and lots of other places. And it's an extra explanation would need to be given if you were going to say that a bomb blowing up your apartment building in Ukraine is somehow more suffering than a bomb blowing up your suffering in, Sana, for example.
One more thing is that countries want to be politically correct, right? When they make allies, if they're supporting a nation,
That's an especially helpful comment. Before the war, before Russia invaded Ukraine, it didn't come up on the news very often, but it came up on the news a little bit. Since 2014, when the war hadn't yet started, but there were real problems between Russia and Ukraine. The Canadian government, since 2014, has been actively, there's an organization that's funded by the Canadian government. I forget the name, and it's something about democracy, this kind of thing. And they funded efforts at what the Canadian government and what the organization in Ukraine describe as exercises in democracy. But it turns out that some of that money, maybe most of that money, has been funneled to Nazi or far right-wing groups that historically are affiliated with Nazi cooperation when the Nazis invaded during World War II. So that they're politically correct is a very recent development. And certainly I don't believe, and I don't want to be construed as saying that that everyone in Ukraine is on the far right. Absolutely not. That there's no evidence for that. On the contrary, there's crystal clear evidence that that's just not true. What's also not quite as crystal clear, but what's been documented, what's even been admitted by the Canadian military, that some of the troops that the Canadian, the Azov Brigade is the particular group that's of concern. The Azov Brigade is historically connected to Ukrainians who cooperated with the Nazis against Soviets and who participated in the extermination of the Jews in Ukraine during World War II. And the Azov Brigade has been trained by Canadian soldiers, training soldiers in Ukraine before the invasion and since the invasion. So that almost never makes it on the CBC. Not quite never, almost never makes it on the CBC. And that conflict, not between how do we do compared to other countries, or the conflict in the sense of logical conflict, the contradiction or the tension, at least, between what we say we do, and especially why we say we do it, and what we're actually doing, raises questions. And you've offered a number of possible good explanations from a social scientific methodology point of view, have to be pursued if you are being serious about an attempt at understanding the drivers of immigration levels historically. But Trebilcock and Kelly make the claim that the Canadian government found it much easier to admit refugees from countries that were fighting communism than from countries, so that it was easier to get accepted as a refugee from Hungary or Czechoslovakia than it was to be accepted as a refugee from El Salvador or Nicaragua, when El Salvador and Nicaragua had socialist governments, or Chile for a while. Chile is a kind of a mixed thing, because ultimately Canada did begin to accept refugees after Pinochet took over from Allende's socialist government in the 1970s. But Canada recognizes refugees in a way more readily that's consistent with its participation and its mirroring of US foreign policy. So US enemies, or you people, yeah, so but I wanted, there's one other aspect of this that I want to take a look at. So their permanent residency application was approved at the last minute, and it was done on humanitarian and compassionate grounds. So this is the vocabulary I want to take a look at. Last week, we saw that there were 4 categories of refugees, 4 categories of migrants to Canada: family, reunification, business class, refugees, and humanitarian and compassionate grounds. Her refugee claim was turned down, and so she was asked to leave. She didn't leave, so a deportation order was issued against her. And so she filed, or a lawyer on her behalf filed a claim for this 4th category. On humanitarian and compassionate grounds, the Canadian government, since 1976, has reserved for itself this special kind of category that allows the government the positive characterization of this, which I think is accurate as far as it goes. It's often what and why it does this is that changing circumstances sometimes move more quickly than bureaucracies can. That's the positive spin, not spin, that's the positive characterization of it. A less positive characterization that fits many cases, not all cases, but many cases, is when the media is mobilized, when this story makes it to the CBC, then the government can't not let her in, because they'll look like shitheads and they'll make Canada look bad. And we don't want to look bad. We don't mind, the argument is, we don't mind being bad, but we don't want to look bad. So once someone catches us, then we're all, oh my goodness, of course we have to accept her. The H&C grounds allows for the government to respond quickly. Sometimes, I think absolutely legitimately, existing definitions and existing bureaucratic structures fail to respond nimbly enough. They fail to respond to shifting situations, and discretion is always part of how bureaucracies operate. So a much smaller, an almost incomparably smaller comparison is here at the college. At the college, there's a policy for professors about accepting work from students that's late. And it used to be that the policy was that students had to show a doctor's note in order for faculty to be allowed to accept that work late. But that changed because you have to pay for doctor's notes. Not everybody can afford to pay for doctor's notes, and COVID happened, where the government, the provincial government, I think in all the provinces, but in Ontario in particular, the one of the responses to COVID was to tell everyone, look, if you think you're sick, just stay home, right? The doctors are overwhelmed, the hospitals are overwhelmed. You're not helping anybody by going to the hospital unless you're really, really sick. Stay home and wait a day or so. Like, don't stay home if you think you're having a heart attack. But if you have a sore throat, don't go to work, don't go to school, stay home. And then if you get it, like, I don't remember what the exact details were. And the college responded along those lines. So you no longer needed a doctor's note. You were asked not to go to the doctors by the province. So how could I ask you to go to the doctors to get a note just to hand in some stupid assignment? Not some stupid assignment, but the work that we do. And professors, though, even though that's the rule, I'm entitled, even if only by the terms of our collective agreement, but certainly in the practice of the college, I've always been allowed to also consider other factors. So if your grandmother died and you went to the funeral, then I'm allowed to, and nobody I know has ever gotten in any trouble. No faculty I know has ever gotten in any trouble, either allowing or not allowing that, now that I think about it. But I'm entitled to some discretion to decide under what conditions I can accept your work late or early. It's up to me to decide whether you looking at your neighbor's page during a midterm counts as cheating or not. There's a background rule. I'm responsible to make sure you don't cheat. There's new vocabulary, academic integrity and so on, but basically it's cheating. I'm responsible for that. I'm not allowed to let you cheat, but I have a margin of movement. I have discretion in this, and more or less all bureaucratic systems allow for some, at least small amount of discretion. They couldn't work otherwise. This is just a formalization. The humanitarian and compassionate grounds is really a formalization of that necessity to allow for that kind of discretion. On the other hand, yeah.
So, I'm just
Yeah.
generalizing.
Sure.
So you're saying that if bureaucracy was involved, then she would have been deported. But since, because of humanitarian grounds, she was allowed to stay with this. If she was not, it would have made Canada look bad.
Well, the if part, we're not sure. The if part we can't tell, but the rest of it is right. And the way it works is that it's the minister, or the minister, not exactly as Sean, forget what his name is, Sean Fraser. The current minister of immigration is Sean Fraser. But it's the office. It's Sean Fraser as Minister of Immigration. In practice, it's someone in his office, someone who works for him, who first sees this. He or she might have seen it on the news, but certainly I know from having worked in an immigration and refugee law office, a long time ago, I'm sure that her lawyer would have written a letter to the minister's office. And in Canada, in most, maybe in all countries, but in most countries, in a big country like Canada, the minister doesn't open his or her own mail, right? There's someone 3 levels below or 10 levels below the minister who opens all the mail. Like, you get thousands, maybe even more than thousands of letters written to the minister. Again, just to compare the institutions, David Agnew doesn't read his own email. If you send an email saying, "Oh my goodness, my INS professor swore in class, could you please fire him?" That email doesn't go to David Agnew, that goes to his assistant. And that email, I'm glad actually, is never going to be answered. So I won't get fired for that. I should smarten up, but that's not the way it's going to happen. So Sean Fraser has the authority, not as Sean Fraser, who lives at 29, wherever he lives, but the Minister of Immigration has the constitutional authority outside of the other normal bureaucratic channels to do this. So Sean Fraser's decision doesn't undermine the refugee board's decision to reject her, and that's an important consideration. The reasons that the refugee board refused her refugee application, they still stand as a precedent. So her neighbor from Uganda, if her neighbor had the same background situation and came to Canada and filed her thing, but her neighbor didn't have a cute kid, or her neighbor didn't work as a PSW, then she wouldn't get in automatically just because Fajuma got in, which would be the case if the refugee board had accepted her refugee claim. So if what happens to me in my home country qualifies me to be a refugee in Canada, according to the refugee board, because it's a quasi-legal panel, that counts as precedent. And so someone who could demonstrate that they had they met the similar conditions that I met, they would then be successful also. So the government wants to separate those things. And that's another purpose of humanitarian and compassionate grounds, is that it allows the government to pick and choose. Okay, so now how are we doing for time? 1:10. Okay. Now, okay, so there was one other thing. Federal judge, Justice Shirzad Ahmed, in a federal court ruling, ruled that applicants who have worked as healthcare aides deserve special consideration. And in the decision, Ahmed wrote, the moral debt owed to immigrants who worked on the front lines to help protect vulnerable people in Canada during the first waves of COVID-19 pandemic cannot be overstated. So an additional component about the low wage work that PSWs did. I was a PSW when I was going to university. They're not just more, they're not, it's not just women are disproportionately represented. So more than half of PSWs are women, and roughly half of the population in Canada are women. So there are more PSWs than would be the case if it was randomly distributed. Likewise, and at least arguably, sociologists tend to be more convinced of and sympathetic to arguments for this than economists do. Low wage jobs are more likely to go to immigrants than they are to native born people. Flipping it over, natives to Canadian born people, including Canadians born to first generation immigrants, are less likely to accept that work than are people born somewhere else who are migrants here. For a variety of different reasons, it's not clear why. The social science on that is much more contested. Like the explanation for it is much less agreed upon by social scientists, but there's wide agreement that the data which claims that to be an accurate description is pretty clear. If you go to a hospital and you check the wages and the place and the citizenship status of the people by wage, you see that there's a higher correlation between low wage work and immigration status and high wage work and immigration status among many disciplines. It's not a one-to-one thing. So here though, the justice in the ruling made this claim. Notwithstanding that, so it's Najuma, I'm sorry, Najuma makes the point, and they repeat the point in the story, that this isn't just about her, notwithstanding the fact that the mechanism through which she was admitted to Canada was this exceptional status granted to her, exceptional in the sort of literal sense of it being an exception to the normal run of things, not exceptional in the way like super good or something like that, just statistically exceptional circumstances. She makes the claim, so they have their piece now. That's not the claim I wanted to say. Earlier on, she says that nobody should go through this and that all migrants should be given this kind of justice. So she connects her case, she herself connects her case to the situation of many people who are here and who would like to be here in Canada, but who can't be. So part of what we're trying to understand is, let me go back now, and I'm going to wrap up with this too. Maybe. Yeah, so. So basically what we're going to try to understand is what explains the distribution of the total number of Canadians or the total number of migrants among these four different classes over time. Why is it that in the 90s, these two flipped? Up until the mid 1990s, this was the largest class percentage-wise of people accepted as immigrants to Canada. But in the 1990s, these two flipped over. And what are the changes between in which refugees are accepted, which grounds were recognized as good ground, as legally valid grounds for accepting the refugee claim, and what are the categories for permanent resident status that's granted on, this is mostly humanitarian and compassionate grounds, the exceptions. What is there a pattern among the exceptions that might explain to us, that could be part of an explanation for the logic of the whole system? And we're going to take a look at a work, at a chapter from a book written by a law professor from, I think she's at UBC, but it might be Simon Fraser. Anyway, a law school in British Columbia called Catherine Dovenne. And she argues that this is the right way, this is the most conceptually rigorous way of understanding what Canadian immigration policy really means, especially when you look at it through the lens that nominally was recognized by Trebilcock and Kelly, the connection between immigration policy and our, how did he put it? Let me get to my slide and then. No, I've lost my slide, or I can't. Right, the contemporary communal self-definite. It's not on the screen though, sorry. So, how can we connect the creation of the generation of this, the generating of, how is this communal, the contemporary communal self-definition of Canada, how does it connect to all of those different classes? The economic class, family reunification class, the refugee class, and the humanitarian and compassionate grounds class. So that's our job for the rest of the semester. And we're going to take a look at, next week we'll complete the nature of the relationship among ideas, interests, and issues. And we'll take a look at the account that Trebilcock and Kelly give. And then I'm going to try to identify a few places where other scholars have criticized, have challenged, say, the logic that Trebilcock and Kelly claim is at work in the interrelationship among these ideas, interests, and issues. They claim that their account fits the reality better. Okay, so thank you very much, and I will see you all next week. And it just occurred to me now, God, I hope that recorded.
Was it not recorded?
I hope so.
Recorded
I
all
didn't
of
turn it off, and I had it set to record automatically, but I didn't think to
Yeah,
check.
it is recording, see? It's in the top.
Oh, good. Right, okay, good. Okay, so now I will turn the recording off. Thank you. Maybe. stop recording. Okay. So goodbye, everyone out there in the cloud. And I will see you, or you will see me anyway. I don't see you, but you'll see me next week.